He gave everything for love and ended up receiving the worst betrayal. Based on true events, David had always been distinguished by his integrity and honesty, qualities that had earned him the respect of everyone around him. He was a dedicated man, proud of his work and his uniform, a symbol of effort and discipline. But above all, he valued his family. From the moment he met Sophie, he knew he had found the woman destined to accompany him in life. She had a natural sweetness, a charming grace, and a smile that could light up any room. What began as a simple story soon transformed into a deep love, and it wasn't long before David decided to marry her, convinced that their love was made to last. To friends and neighbors, they were a perfect couple. They were always seen together, sharing laughter, projects, and dreams. No one questioned their happiness. David trusted Sophie blindly. He never suspected a thing, because there was no room for doubt in his heart. He was sure she loved him with the same passion with which he loved her. His days passed between the commitment of his work and the excitement of returning home, where his wife greeted him with affection and a warm smile. What he didn't know was that, behind this apparent harmony, a dark secret was beginning to brew, one that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The uniform David wore every day was much more than part of his job. It represented his honor, his promise to protect and provide. For him, it was also a silent commitment to Sophie, a way to ensure her stability and well-being. In the eyes of everyone, she reciprocated that effort with love and admiration. She accompanied him to family gatherings, praised him in public, and expressed pride in her exemplary husband. However, in private, something had begun to change. There were times when Sophie seemed absent, her gaze lost, as if her mind wandered far from that home. David noticed it, but he preferred to think it was simply worry or fatigue. He never imagined there was another reason. Every time she avoided his eyes or isolated herself with her phone in her hand, he made excuses. "She's busy. I shouldn't mistrust her." That absolute faith in his wife became the blindfold that prevented him from seeing reality. And while the truth remained hidden, it grew silent, spreading like a shadow. Everything seemed calm on the surface, but that calm was merely the prelude to an inevitable storm. The first clue appeared one afternoon when David returned from work earlier than expected. He found Sophie talking on the phone in a low voice and, upon seeing her, quickly hung up. When he asked her who she was talking to, she replied with a nervous smile that she was just a friend. David didn't doubt her word, but that unease remained etched in his mind. Days later, he discovered that Sophie had started going out more frequently. Sometimes she said she was going shopping, other times she was visiting a neighbor, but she never gave clear details. David tried to convince himself that everything was fine. He kept telling himself that trust was the foundation of marriage and that mistrust would be unfair. However, the heart has a sixth sense, and his was starting to tell him something was wrong, even though his mind refused to accept it. Anxiety began to grow inside him. He no longer slept peacefully, and Sophie's absence became a silent torture. That inner voice, which had once been quiet, became deafening. It told him he needed to open his eyes before it was too late. One day, David decided to follow his instinct. After finishing his shift, instead of returning home at his usual time, he took a different route and arrived unexpectedly. Upon entering, he noticed Sophie wasn't there. The house was quiet, but on the table, he found his wife's purse, which meant she hadn't gone shopping as she'd said. His heart began to pound. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place in his mind, even though he still refused to accept the possibility of betrayal. He walked around the living room, looked around, and soon found Sophie's phone on the sofa. The screen was still displaying an incoming message. With trembling hands, David picked it up and read a few words that left him breathless. "See you at the usual place. I want to see you. I miss you." He felt a void in his chest, as if the floor had opened up beneath his feet. The doubt was no longer a doubt. It was the first clear sign that something was wrong. That night, David couldn't sleep. His thoughts filled with images, questions, and a pain that seemed impossible to contain. The next day, he tried to behave normally in front of Sophie. He watched her prepare breakfast, smile as if nothing had happened, and discuss simple plans for the weekend. David watched her silently, fighting the emotions that consumed him inside. Part of him wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but another, stronger part screamed at him that he was facing a well-disguised lie. Sophie noticed his distant look and asked if everything was okay. He replied with a simple yes, hiding the storm that was invading him. This wasn't the time to confront her. First, he needed proof, something to confirm what he suspected, so he wouldn't have to live with the doubt. That morning, he made the decision. He would discover the truth, even if it shattered his soul. And with that decision, the story took a turn with no return. David began to observe Sophie more closely. Every call, every excuse, every gesture was silently analyzed. He mentally noted the time she left and the places she said she went. Little by little, the pattern became evident. There was always a friend to visit, but she never mentioned a specific name or brought anything to justify these outings. David, who for years had been a confident and quiet man, now lived like an investigator in his own home. Even so, the pain was enormous. He didn't want to be a spy. He wanted to go back to being the husband who blindly trusted his wife. But something inside him told him that nothing would ever be the same, that sooner or later the truth would come out. And, indeed, what he was about to discover would surpass anything he had imagined. One afternoon, after finishing his shift, David decided to follow Sophie without her noticing. He saw her leave hurriedly, carrying her usual bag, and head down the road toward the center of Amsterdam. His heart was beating so hard he felt it might betray him. Every step she took was a mixture of fear, anger, and sadness. Sophie walked into a discreet cafe, one of those where few people notice anyone else. David watched her from outside, hidden behind a lamppost. Minutes later, a man appeared and sat across from her. They greeted each other with a gesture that left no room for doubt. They looked at each other and spoke with a complicity that no one could doubt. David clenched his fists tightly. Seeing with his own eyes what he feared was like receiving a stab in the soul. Sophie smiled differently, a smile she hadn't shared with him in a long time. That was the cruelest confirmation. In that instant, David understood that the betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a reality before his eyes. He could have gone inside immediately, confronted them right there, but he didn't. Something inside him called for calm, even though his insides burned like fire. He took out his phone and did what he never thought he'd do. He took a photo of Sophie and that man together. He didn't do it out of revenge, but because he needed proof. He needed to stop feeling like it was all a product of his imagination. He spent several minutes watching, and every gesture between them was another dagger. The glances, the laughter, the closeness. David felt time stop, as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. He breathed heavily, his mind in turmoil. How could the woman for whom he had given everything have betrayed him like that? His heart shattered. He left silently, without Sophie noticing. That day, he knew his life would never be the same. That night, when he returned home, David found her as if nothing had happened. Sophie greeted him with a smile and a hug, as if he hadn't shared moments with another man at the cafe. He watched her silently, his heart breaking, but without saying a word. His strategy was clear: wait for the right moment to confront her. While they ate dinner, she told him trivial anecdotes, and every word she said was like another lie on the table. David could barely contain himself. The pain burned inside him, but his discipline and self-control kept him steadfast. In his mind, he had already decided that he wouldn't let any more time pass. The betrayal had to come to light, and she would have to look him in the eye when he showed her the truth. That night, alone in the bedroom, he went over the photo he had taken again and again. Every time he looked at it, the pain sharpened. Dawn would bring an inevitable confrontation, and David was determined to face Sophie without fear. The next morning, David woke up with a heavy heart, but determined not to live in silence any longer. He prepared breakfast as usual, trying to appear calm, although his hands were trembling slightly. Sophie appeared with a serene expression, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. He looked at her with a mixture of sadness and anger. She was the woman he had loved with all his soul, but also the one who had betrayed his trust. He decided to start the conversation delicately, asking her what her plans were for the day. Sophie, unsuspecting, replied with the same excuse as always. She was going to visit a friend. It was at that moment that David felt the truth had to come out once and for all. "Sophie, are you sure you're telling me the truth?" David asked firmly, but without raising his voice. She looked at him in confusion and, after a few seconds, smiled as if to dispel the tension. "Of course I am, David. Why do you doubt me?" she replied, trying to continue with her routine. Then he took his phone out of his pocket and placed the photo he had taken the previous afternoon on the table. Sophie froze. Her face changed instantly, and that confident smile crumbled like a sandcastle. She couldn't respond. The silence in the room became heavier than any words. David, tears in his eyes, repeated, "Why did you do this to me?" Sophie tried to stammer out an explanation. She said he was an old friend, that they had met by chance. But the images spoke for themselves, and David was no longer willing to listen to excuses. "He's not just a friend, Sophie. I was there. I saw the way you looked at him, the way you smiled, that smile you no longer had for me." He lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. The silence of her nonverbal confession was more painful than any words. David felt the love he had felt for so many years turn to ash in a matter of seconds. The pain was unbearable, but there was also a strange peace within him. He finally knew the truth. That morning, his home was no longer the refuge he had dreamed of. Now it was just an empty stage where betrayal reigned. After that confrontation, David was never the same. His days passed between work and a profound silence that consumed him from within. Sophie tried to get closer to him, begging for forgiveness through tears, but the wounds were too deep. Betrayal can't be erased with words, much less when love was given unconditionally. David knew he had to make a decision: continue living with the woman who had deceived him or free himself from that pain forever. It wasn't easy, because there were still memories, shared moments, and a part of him that still loved her. But his self-respect was stronger than the habit of staying together. With tears in his eyes, he told Sophie it was over. Sophie, desperate, tried to stop him. She begged him to forgive her, swore it had been a mistake, that she still loved him, that she would never see him again, perpetuating his love for her. David listened to her in silence, but he no longer saw in her the woman he had known years before. All he saw was the reflection of a lie that had destroyed all the plans he had made with her. That night, he gathered some of his things and left the house he had worked so hard to build. The pain was unbearable, but he also felt that, for the first time in a long time, he could breathe. He had lost a love, yes, but he had also regained his dignity. And that was the first step toward a new life, even if he had to rebuild it from scratch. Over time, David realized that Sophie's betrayal wasn't the end of his story, but the beginning of another chapter. He learned that trust is a treasure that should never be taken for granted, and that true love never betrays. His pain turned into strength, and his experience into a lesson that marked him forever. Sometimes life breaks us to teach us how to rise stronger. David, that man who had given everything, knew he hadn't lost. He had won the chance to start over. And although the scars remained in his soul, so did the certainty that he deserved true love. Because in the end, what seemed like the worst ending became the beginning of his freedom. What would you do in David's place? Leave your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to continue receiving real stories like this one that touch your heart.